Thanks so much, Crystal, and thanks IEJ and Dewey and Sherilyn and Pamela and everyone for organizing this. Just to give you a little bit of my background though, growing up in South Africa, our central kind of theoretical training and imagination with which we challenged the established order was Marxism. So we all grew up reading all of that literature, but what was really clear for me and other emerging feminists, we didn't have much of academic feminism when I went to university. There was no such thing as any course teaching gender at all. Gender was not even considered to be a category of analysis. And so we had to kind of build the road as we were walking it, as we were having to deal with what the exclusion of thinking about gender in the university meant. And the inspiration really came from the actual lives and struggles of ordinary women who may not have been theorizing gender, but who were certainly thinking about the effects of gendered inequality. So my early sort of shift from Marxism was actually to become a socialist feminist, and we can talk about the differences between Marxism and socialism if people would like, but certainly I still call myself a socialist feminist for what that is worth these days, not an easy position to occupy, but socialist feminism really is a way of thinking. Some people, are using the frame of intersectionality today. I want to say in Africa, we've always been intersectional. We've always understood that class, race, gender, and sexuality work together to structure power. But so I'll come to some of that. What I'm going to do is talk about a subset of the social reproduction problematic, and that is the care part of it. So in some ways, I think you might find that I am repeating, but Achad and I both have as our common mentor Professor Jacqueline Koch, and one thing that Jacqueline Koch taught me about how to teach effectively is reiteration is good. Repetition is bad, but reiteration is good. So think of what I'm going to do as reiteration. So care, a difficult concept. So care is a really interesting concept, but it's a really difficult concept to pin down because it's malleable. It changes so much. What is care? How it is defined is both rooted in our social and cultural practices, the kinds of ways in which we come to think of the world through received traditions and so on. But it is also economically rooted. And that relationship between culture and the economy is really important when thinking about care, because in patriarchal systems, in heteronormative patriarchal systems, actually the ideology of care acts to conceal the political economic relations that underpin it. So it's a really tricky terrain because people don't want to give up on their ideas that they've received from mothers, grandmothers, often through a female line of thinking. And the whole economy is structured to turning our eyes away from thinking about care as something rooted in the economy. You did, of course, have Alessandra Mezzadri's first couple of days, right, in which I think she showed, I wasn't here, but I imagine she showed very clearly the production-reproduction nexus in capitalism. It's also, so care is part of that ideology that is used to normalize and justify hierarchies of power and used to legitimate the extraction of unpaid labor, mostly from women, but also sometimes from children. So, you know, when we think about care, we think about you know, what it is. The sort of central question for me is, you know, care is about thinking about whose life matters, whose life matters in our society, and that means looking at where care is located, when care is conducted, who does the caring, in which spaces they do that caring. So care is the result of choice. It's presented as naturalized, but I want to tell you that in my framework, theoretically, care is a choice. There's a choice about where to locate it, who is going to do it, how it is valued, and that choice is not only a choice made within communities and families, but it's a choice made by governments. It is a choice made by political parties, and it's a choice made by corporates as well. So I think what I want to bring into our conversation that I feel perhaps has been sort of under thought about is, what does this mean for us collectively in terms of the kind of politics we engage in? What are our demands to the state? Because this point about it being shaped, finding expression in public policy and legislation means that we have to look at the state very closely as an arena of struggle. You know, I get that for some people, we've had, you know, comments about, like, forget about the state, forget about legislation. From where I come from as a political historian, I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think we have to put the state into our thinking and our conversation. And let's see if I can begin to explain why as we go along. But one thing I also want to just point out about the state is that when you look at the evolution of the state, the elaboration of the thing we call the state, the institutions, right, the departments, the government departments, the officials, and, you know, even more broadly, Parliament. When you look at that, you see how historically the state is itself constituted by the choices that are made about who will do what and where. Right? So we have over time evolved departments of welfare and departments of health and so on, all of which are absolutely defined in unspoken, invisibilized ways by some notion of the relationship between paid and unpaid labor, and between the normative notion of women as natural carers who do not have to be compensated because they will do it out of love. And let's talk about love from a slightly different perspective today, and see if we can, you know, if we can complicate that. Sometimes we think of care as being everything, and when you're thinking politically, you have to make choices. So we'll come to this again. Now, we know historically, you know this, we've been saying it all week, the bulk of both paid and unpaid care across the world and over time has been done by women. United Nations recent studies say women on average spend more than 3 times the amount of time than men on unpaid care and household tasks. That's no news to us in this room. We know it, we feel it, we do it, right? So that's nothing new in that. But in part that rests on the idea that women are naturally caring, that women are good at caring, that there's something about us innately, somehow built into our DNA, that makes us more caring. And even, I'll come to this in a minute, but even some feminists would like us to think in that way. But if you look at the economic statistics over time, you will see that care historically and today in the world is provided by people who are generally, whose status in society is low, who have very little political power. That's not only women, but in the past provided by slaves, in colonial contexts by by black people. That black and white people don't mobilize notions of care in the same way, or they're not allowed to access the same notions of care. And today, it's still the case that people from the global south are providing the care for much of the global north. And immigrants, and low-paid immigrants, people with very little rights, sometimes undocumented, which makes it even worse. So, which makes them or tied to their visa statuses, tied to particular employers and jobs, which makes it almost impossible for them to leave a job if they are being abused. Okay, so let's look at some of the feminist literature which has tried to think about care. And there's one set of debates which I've put together under the label care as virtue, care as a good thing, right? And it comes from different sorts of places. One of the places it comes from is a kind of feminist critique of liberalism, which tends to think about at least philosophically, about us as autonomous individuals, which means we care for ourselves and make no claims on others. And certainly we make no claim on the state to care for us, right? We shouldn't make any claim on public resources to care for us. And the responses to that in normative philosophy have been to say, no, care is not this individual thing that you just look after yourself and you get on with your life. Care is something that is good, that enhances humanity, that when we give, when we care for others, and when we receive care, we affirm our humanness. We affirm that we are related and not islands in capitalism. So there's something virtuous about caring, regardless of the gender of who provides the care. Care is something that human society needs and thrives on. And it's something that has to be taken into philosophy. So an example of this is a feminist called Carol Gilligan, one of the earliest theorists of care. And Carol Gilligan kind of tried to overturn the idea that women are the patriarchal notion that women are not good enough to be political actors, that women, are better confined to the home. And she said, well, let's rethink that. Who decides that publicness, or being in the public sphere, politicians and so on, that all those male virtues are better than the female virtues? What if we overturned that hierarchy and said, yes, women do care more than men, and that instead of considering that to be a lesser democratic value, let's call that a positive value. Let's say that actually that's what the world needs: more feminine located notion of society, and that instead of talking about justice and rights in the public sphere, let's talk about attachment, let's talk about intimacy, let's talk about care for others, right? That that masculinity is tied to autonomy. Now when you talk about autonomy and rights, those are very masculinist concepts, and female virtues actually are morally superior, and that for a good society we should rather have more women's values in the public sphere. So here she's trying to kind of attack the notion of value, but not from an economic point of view, rather a moral point of view. Economic, not that we will look at women and men's work and we'll revalue it in moral terms. That was Gilligans' central contribution. And out of that, it's sort of simplifying a very long trajectory of political and philosophical thinking among feminists, but out of that comes this ethics of care notion, that what we need to develop is not politics based on rights and justice, but a politics based on the ethics of care. So what were the problems with that? And the feminist debate is rich and long, right? So you can ask me more questions, but the one critique of the Gilligan type of model and other such early feminist theorists is that they really use the white middle class norm in the North. That's what they're building their theory from. And their universal subject is the white middle class family and men and women within those, right? There was no attention in Gilligan's work or any of those other early theorists to how care was coerced from slaves in the United States, for example. So she writes about the United States, but she doesn't think that black women have a different kind of history of care. And that care was coerced out of them, that there were that the affective relationships between slave and master were far from nurturing, right? So there was a demand for a certain kind of affect in an exploitative relationship. You should watch 12 Years a Slave. If you haven't, it's a great representation of this critique, right? That at the same time as black people are required to provide care to white families, they are denied care themselves. They are denied, they are not considered to be worthy of being cared for. And so not only are they not cared for by the institutions developed to care for us in society, but they are put in a position where they have to deny their own kin the care that they are providing to white people, right? So this early theorization of care was very unsatisfying for black feminists and for feminists in the global South. Who kind of couldn't think of care only in that virtuous way and didn't, wanted to really complicate what that meant. Now, you'll know that it may have been coerced from slaves, but it's still coerced today through various structures in the labor market, right? It's not, so it's not over. Hayat spoke yesterday about Joan Tronto and Lisa Rudick. That kind of those feminists who came later than Gilligan, and they kind of tried to think a little differently, to move away from that essentialist idea that women are naturally caring, will be naturally good carers, to think about care as political and social resources, to make an argument from a different place rather than the Gilligan place, which is about our innate virtues. So they wanted to kind of think about what if we understood care not only as that which happens within the family, within the community, but sort of more broadly in society. So they've started to talk about how we might value motherhood, not as a biological role. This kind of speaks to us in Africa, right? That mothering is not just what you do for your own biological children, but it's a sort of a social role that you may stand in the place of mother to children, maybe not even children you know, but you will, that relationship. is a social resource. And to say that it's not because women are innately good at mothering, but because for so long women have had to care for vulnerable people that they have developed the capacity to be alert to the needs of vulnerable people, right? So that's a more material historical kind of argument. And so overall, if social policies were to listen to women, not because they're essentially better nurturers, but because their social roles of caring, their social reproductive roles, make them understand what is needed to have a better society, then we'd have better policies. So they're kind of leaving behind essentialism and gender binaries, and rather thinking about social reproduction and the behaviors it has produced and the insights that come from it. So what that literature is trying to do is to end exploitation in care work, to think about care work as valuable in the unpaid sector, to think of care work as important whether it's conducted in institutions or within intimate social settings, and so adding to the idea that care has to be valued, right? But all that literature, I think, still leaves us with this conundrum that we continue to there isn't quite an answer for it yet. So women's movements constantly are kind of moving between these registers, and that is this conundrum. When we valorize women's difference, whether we valorize it give value to it, whether it's biological, or we say, well, it's historically that has been, social reproduction has been the role of women, so, women have a different insight. Are we reinforcing patriarchy or not? It's just a conundrum. I put it out there. I think one has to ask that always in the politics that we conduct. So we are careful because, to go back to my earlier point, so much of the economic distribution of care is resting on a patriarchal notion of who should do the care, right? So we always have to keep that question alert. So more recent thinking, which Kaya took us into yesterday, extends the question of care to non-humans and non-sentient beings, right? To nature itself, to the broad to the ways in which we are all interrelated. We are nature. I also liked Sibongile's formulation of the soil is our soul, right? That's about a sense that we are tied to the environment, like we're part of a set of relationships, whether we like it or not. And our survival as a species depends on us seeing our obligations to care and not placing our own needs, poorly defined needs, like having however 20 pairs of shoes or a cell phone like that's placing human desire over the planet, right? The other interesting thing about planetary care that matters for the way in which we think about states and politics is that planetary care takes us beyond a nationalistic framework for thinking about the politics we engage in and the policies we want to push for, right? So it's not just about our country and what our country wants or needs, but seeing that what happens up there in the north affects us, what we do here affects someone else, just seeing that interrelationship. It has a relationship to space, but it also has a relationship to time, because planetary care implies that we are concerned with a time horizon that is beyond our own lives. It spans generations, and so we have in managing managing and caring for resources, we have an eye to what future generations do. I live in Canada now, and I learned something really interesting from Indigenous Canadians, which is the 7 generations notion, that history moves through, that is defined by 7 generations of care. So you have to, your generation has to look to the next 7 generations, or the next 6. Mm-hmm. So we're all bound in this relationship of reciprocity mm-hmm. to the next 6 generations, and that where we are today is the product of the previous 6 generations, right? That 7 generations notion is really interesting, I think, for thinking about care in a planetary way. Okay, so that's some of the feminist literature. I want to come to what was most influential for me, and perhaps where I locate myself, which is within the socialist trajectories that really look at the relationship between production and reproduction, looking at critiquing the conventional Marxist theory that accorded surplus value or profit, thinks of value as being that which creates profit, right? And that I think what we need to think about is how women's labor, unpaid labor, contributes to surplus value. So in this kind of framework, social reproduction is, and care is not just as a sort of cultural thing, but it is a structural feature of capitalism. Unpaid reproductive labor, I'm repeating now, again, I'm reiterating, that unpaid reproductive labor subsidizes profit, that it obscures the real cost of the wage, and ongoing costs of the reproduction of labor power, right? I don't know whether in the first 2 days was there a discussion of things like family wage and union demands that, in which the male worker was centered. I mean, but yeah, a little bit of that. And so as I said, Federici, criticizes Marxism for not thinking about primitive accumulation as also a gendered project, and not only a project in which a kind of, one group appropriates land, but like labor is part of the primitive accumulation, right? Okay, so we've spoken about Federici a lot in the last few days, and I think many of us find her work so thoroughly useful because of this, because she theorizes this so coherently for us. So if it is accumulation, a primitive accumulation and the appropriation of women's labor, then one of the things that follows is that we have to change the way we think of what women do. And those unpaid tasks, calling those unpaid tasks work, changes the conversation, right? Because it shows us that when you shift from seeing it from work to that lovely word care, which is all touchy-feely, and we all need care and we all want care, right? But when you call it work, then you see something else, because you see that there's a patriarchal ideology at play here that normalizes this extraction of labor. It says, and we, as always happens with ideology of all sorts, rests on the oppressed buying into it. Rests on the oppressed buying into the ideas of the normatively powerful, right? So that's how ideology works, because then we don't see that what we are doing is upholding a structure of power. And that's why words matter, and that's partly why you have this debate about care and how to think of it. So once we think of it as work, and then we think of it as being tied to production and productivity, then we extend the question Now, and this is a really nice work by Nancy Falbray, a Marxist feminist economist, who says, well, we must ask, who pays for care? Who cares for the children, right, is her question. Who pays for the kids? Who is caring for the kids? Because that tells you something about the structuring of value in the economy. So who pays for care changes the way in which we think of capitalism itself. So suddenly it's an economic question and not a moral question, right? It expands the way in which you think about the spaces in which capitalism operates, not just in the factory, but also within the home, right? So it takes us to a different space of the economy. So it radicalizes the very notion of revolution, at least for Marxists, to include the social. One example of that is the Wages for Housework campaign, which Federici was part of, and that was a lever that was about opening up. They didn't really want women to be paid for housework. It was a strategic way of saying, they didn't want to commodify, but they were saying, if we think of wages for housework, would we think differently about value, right? But in South Africa, I've done a lot of historical work on women's demands, and you can go back through the 20th century and you see how often in women's demands and their protests and their pamphleteering and so on, right into the first Women's Charter in 1955, you see 56, sorry, getting old. You see how there's a demand to change who does the work of looking after children and old people. It's in our own charter, it's in our own politics from below, not rooted in Federici type of Marxism, but just as astute, right? Just as clear-eyed about where the sources of women's exploitation lie. How we will allocate care between these domains of families, markets, civil society, and state. The care diamond, it used to be the care triangle, then became the care diamond, all of these. But basically across these domains, who will do what? You know, who will care for children as opposed to who will care for someone who's sick, right? And so people's needs got articulated in terms of which of those institutions would be responsible institutions. Now, I did want to say this about those northern welfare states, particularly the social democratic welfare states. So they come out of a particular historical moment. They come out of a moment of enormous socialist mobilization by the unions, right, in which there's significant challenges, and the welfare state emerges as a compromise, a way of in a sense, damping down revolutionary fervor by granting some of the demands that were being made by unions in a range of ways around unemployment insurance and so on. But in some countries, like Sweden, early on, women's movements feminists were able to make significant inroads by aligning themselves with trade unions and social democratic parties. They were able to say, you know, we will not support you in this election if you do not include our demands, including demands for maternity leave initially, into your demands to the state for public provisioning of the kind of tasks that women are responsible for. So they were able to include those demands. Sometimes it took a really big battle. In some countries like Sweden, they were assisted by demographic issues. So, you know, Sweden, so like again, I'm a political historian, so context really matters. You can't take Sweden as a model and say, well, why don't we do that in South Africa or in Kenya or in Ghana? Because at the time that they were elaborating these arguments, Sweden had a labor shortage. It needed women in the workforce. In order to have women in the, women were not going into the workforce because of their domestic responsibilities, their social reproductive responsibility, but also they were not going into the workforce and increasing poverty in Sweden in the early 20th century into the 1930s, by the way. They're a very poor country, needed more workers. Women were beginning to have fewer children, so they were worried about social reproduction in the long term, about the workforce in the long term. So quite often you see in these countries in the north, in the early 20th century, a kind of alignment between nationalistic, capitalist, and gender interests in quite interesting ways. In France, for example, a lot of maternalistic policies aimed at supporting mothers, for example, come out of the notion that that the nation depends on women. So it's like so they give allowances for women to have lots of children. The more children you had, the more allowances you got. And they keep telling us that there's a problem with the child support grant. They should look at the history of grants everywhere. But those mothers' allowances, they're very much tied into ideas about the strength of the nation, the future of the nation, etc. So nationalism plays a big role here. So there's interesting alignment of different kinds of politics in different moments. And sometimes you get really important demands being made out of that. So what did feminists get into the policies? Let's not look for pure politics. Let's look at what were the outcomes of some of these debates. What were they able to insert into the country's policy systems? Well, it's because of those demands that you have an expansion of public services. We talk and have been talking about the commons. This was a kind of protection of in a certain way of the commons, right? You got the state to employ more caregivers. You got budget lines added to the national policy-making process to cover a range of care needs of the society. So you have, things like tax rebates for having children, national accounts in which care starts to be counted, the emergence of time use studies, right, where they begin to show that if you include women's unpaid labor, then then suddenly women look like very productive. Even women who are not formally working suddenly look like they're very productive members of a capitalist economy, right? You get paid maternal and paternal leave. Now, there's some critique around this, some worries in the literature in the 80s and the 90s that really what it did is move the private sphere of the family to public provisioning, and that maybe this was replacing public patriarchy with private patriarchy. So now we're no longer dependent on husbands, we're dependent on the state. But nevertheless, those child care centers and those care homes significantly reduced the burdens on women, right? They really impacted the distribution of care in the private sphere. So there's this phenomenon called the Nordic gender effect. The Nordic gender effect basically is a kind of term that shows how the introduction of more gender-sensitive policies around, for example, parental leave, that say, okay, instead of just having maternity leave, where we're just reproducing, that women will do the childcare, why don't we have forms of leave that are available to parents, and that parents can, mothers and fathers can take this leave, that say it's a year of paid leave, that year cannot be taken by the mother. So some portion of that year's leave has to be taken by the father, or it's lost. So suddenly you see that men are beginning to do way more childcare. If you look at the sociological studies now, you will see places like Norway, Finland, and so on, many more men actually doing care. Doesn't change the overall structure. By the way, it's a long and complicated story around that we can talk about. You know, men are still reluctant to take leave. Sometimes families make a decision that the men won't take the leave because their jobs are better paid, and you know, it's always more complicated. We can we can discuss that. Okay, so sorry about this very wordy slide. But okay, the slides will go up, and you can and the paper, hey? Are they lovely slides? Thank you very much. They are only so lovely because Crystal showed me how to make them look better yesterday. So thanks to Crystal. Lots of downsides, right? So it was not, you know, the social democratic states are not also glorious in terms of these outcomes. So some of the things we have learned from studying them, I think, you know, the new inequalities, sometimes they're the unintended consequences of policies, right? But new inequalities emerge. Firstly, you know, public provisioning, the fact that it's provided by the state doesn't mean the care is going to be better, that the quality of the care will necessarily be better than that provided in families. We know now that the wages that have been attached to doing those expand the number of jobs in the care sector, but the wages don't match the moral value that the state is now saying, well, ethics of care, good, yeah, that's the way we're going to go. But then you get people being paid poorly. Those jobs are still done mainly by women. And now you have a situation where the care economy is part of the economy of profit, right? So it is it's privatized. The care in the neoliberal system may be subsidized by the state, but is privately delivered. And those private delivery systems have created markets in care. So care centers become profit centers. I'll give you an example from the city I live in now in Toronto. So they established as part of their welfare state a number of care homes for old people. State subsidized care homes. They then hand those care homes over to a private company to run. The private company is seeking to maximize profit. So the private company has stripped workers in. So who does it employ? It employs immigrants, newly arrived. It pays them not as a full-time job, but in a kind of gig economy kind of way, so they're paid for shifts. The pay that's attached to the shifts is not enough, so care workers frequently are working more than 2 or 3 care homes in a week in order to make enough to live, right? So there's a whole market in care. Meanwhile, the companies, you know, by the way, of course, are raking in profit, and that market in care is also a global market in care, because they're often the people doing the care are leaving behind their families. It's often women, but also men, they're coming to Canada, say, they leave their families behind, they're going to earn enough to bring their families in, but they create this deficit of care, right? So it's what Arlie Hochschild calls the global chain. Costs of the northern states having care are carried in developing countries by lack of care, by children being left behind, families basically not even they benefit from remittances, but there's a care deficit that is created. So in the North, it's not as if feminists don't see all of these problems. So someone you might want to read the work of, really fantastic theorist, feminist theorist in the UK, Diane Elson. She had a lot of impact in South Africa as well. She was part of helping us to decide in the early 90s how we might decide better systems in South Africa. But she's come up with what she calls the 3R strategy for care for these northern states, but we should think about it too, right? The 3 R's: recognize, reduce, redistribute. Recognize care, which means not only recognize it by saying, oh, isn't it wonderful that women are such great carers of children and we must celebrate women and put mothers on a pedestal. No, her notion of recognition is that we must recognize it in the hard indicators we use to measure the economy and the health of the economy, right? I'm going to skip through this very quickly. You can go and Google it, and they're very nice materials online. We have to reduce the burdens on women of unpaid care, and that will free up women's time to be full citizens. So, you know, she's arguing that saying that care is a form of citizenship still locks women into being the carers and leaves women without the time to engage in a whole range of other activities which may be political mobilization in their own interest, but may equally simply be leisure time to relax, to pursue all of those other interests that Marx thought we should have, like fishing in the morning and reading in the afternoon and philosophy in the evening, right? That requires time, and women have been historically time poor. So reduce the burdens, and then she says redistribute these responsibilities, redistribute time, redistribute resources, so that everybody in society is responsible for care, and that care, the more we all take care of ourselves, the less burden of care there is, right? So, you know, it strikes me, so some of this really, like living in a country that was for a long time quite a good welfare state, Canada now. I'm like, I live in it as an outsider, but some things really strike me about it. You will never walk into a university canteen and find anything messy on the table. And it's not because they have a large number of workers cleaning it up, it's because everybody cleans up around themselves. There are minimum wage laws, so ordinary people don't have domestic workers to clean, right? So then the tasks have to be redistributed to all the members of the household because there's a high level of female workforce participation. Okay, so all of those redistributive elements. So this model has kind of played into a plan developed by the Women's Budget Group in the UK, which is a group of feminist economists, a feminist plan for a caring and sustainable economy. You can Google it, and they cost what it would mean to do all of these things. They show where the money would come from, so their approach is an economic approach, and it's an approach that says we are going to engage the state because those public resources belong to everybody. So we're going to make demands on the state and on political parties, and here are the concrete things that they suggest we do. I won't give you the detail of it for good reason. Because what about us, right? Because we live in different economic systems, in a sense, different kinds of, we live in the same economic system, but we're in another place within the neoliberal global economy. So here in African countries, we have different relationships between citizens and the state that come from our history of colonialism, in which the idea was not of the citizenship relationship to the state, but a subject relation to the state, right? An oppressive relationship in which the state did to us, not in which we elected representatives who would act in our interests. And the state has become a space of itself of accumulation and repression. And, with a colonial legacy, let me hold on to that, where we have different notions of entitlement to the state. State doesn't think of us, states don't think of us, ordinary people, as having entitlements. They think of themselves as a kind of welfare institution. And by the way, of course, many of us live in countries that are highly indebted, in which the decision making is not even happening within our national parliament, so our national budgetary offices. It's coming from somewhere else, coming from the World Bank or the IMF, with their specific set of conditionalities about how money should be spent, right? So through the 1980s, with SAPs, with structural adjustment programs, we saw how care burdens, care services, the hospitals, the clinics, the education system, all of that was shifted onto families and communities in the within that neoliberal ideology of cutting back on the state, make the state as small as possible. So, and we are living in societies in which most of the care work, even the paid work, takes place it's like not even something that is part of legislation and policy. It's totally privatized, right? So we have a legacy in which, whose lives matter for the purposes of care is inflected by very colonial, raced and gendered notions of who should do care work, and with very real consequences. So if you look at, let me just talk about South Africa, because I know this story especially well. Unpaid care work is not something you will find strongly featured in a women's movement mobilization, right? Unlike some other countries. Why? Because cheap family labor is readily available, and middle-class women have not felt the pinch enough. They can go out to work, educated middle-class women can go out to work and have a cousin come from a rural area and provide very cheap labor for them. So there's no class solidarity, no gender solidarity across class of the kind that there was, say, in Sweden, that would produce a demand on political parties, unions, and the state to think about care. So it's sort of fallen outside. That's the one, right? And it's usually those either your relative or your neighbor who's doing the care, that's negotiated between women. It's not even the domain of men. Women negotiate it among themselves, sometimes very creatively. I thought one of the most creative things that I heard of was a group in Soweto in which they pooled the child support grant and created a creche. So the mothers put the child support grant into a sort of kitty, like a Stockwell, and they had one of the women in the neighborhood set up a creche, and they used that money to pay her and to pay for the food for the children. So sometimes it's very creative, and it's good that it happens in that way, but there's no demand on the state is the issue. But also in South Africa, maybe so in other African countries, care that is provided by families and the community is seen to be morally superior ties to Vida's question, to that which is provided via the public purse. So we valorize unpaid care or poorly paid care because we think it's better than something that is publicly provided. And why is that? Well, you know, we have good reasons in our experience of public care. The state has been cruel to citizens, so it's not that it's just, you know, comes out of nowhere. No, people do know that, you know, public services can be very brutalizing, right? They know that, and policing is brutal, welfare agents are brutal, social workers can be brutal. Okay, so it's not that people are crazy, but nevertheless it ties into that ideology that really the family is what we need to protect above all else, and but what we do if we don't have a feminist approach to how the family is centered in social protection policies is that we remove all the possibilities of good quality state-provided institutions of care. We don't make demands for support for socialized programs like good quality kindergartens that will early childhood education, for example, that could happen. We assume that old people are better cared for in the home, and yes, very often they are better cared for in the home, but who is carrying that burden? What do we, every now and then these stories surface in the press of an old person who's been beaten up, or a woman who has left her newborn baby in a garbage can. And so when we simply say family is best, is that always the case? What do we do about those cases? Do we not have a responsibility to create a set of alternatives that might be there for the overburdened women? Because actually, when we say family and community are better spaces for care, we're reinventing the idea that women are the better carers in their individual capacities. And as a result, the statistic, the global studies of care showed that the most unshared system of care in the world is in Africa. 70% provided by unpaid individual caregivers within homes and communities. Maybe in some of those better, in some places, those families may pay for education, or they provide housing, they provide food, right? But equally, those carers can be very, very vulnerable. They can be in very cruel and exploitative situations. And what we've done is leave that up to chance. Where we're saying, well, you may have the good luck that you, a young 15, 16-year-old from a rural community, will go to the city and look after your cousin's children, and they will send you to school and they will give you clothing and housing, and in a few years you'll have a better job. Or you may be very unlucky and you may be locked into that system of caring with minimal wages forever. So what do we want? Questions of care, just to say again, questions of care put us into exactly that space of what is the kind of society we want to be. So there's this really nice project that is started by someone called Salima Valiani with the UN, and she has been working on developing for the UN something called the Africa Care Economy Index. And what they did with the Care Economy Index is to look at each of the states on the continent and evaluate how well they do on a range of markers. So how well, so because we have the story about us in Africa that we are caring and sharing, and we believe in Ubuntu, and we're not like those Western individualists, etc., etc. We care here. We look after people, not like those white people in the north who don't look after their people. That is our narrative, okay? So they say, okay, well, let's look at how well we do in terms of the kind of care, how is care recognized and supported. In a range of ways. So in these domains, maternity or parental leave, socialized childcare, in other words, are there childcare centers where you can leave your child when you go to work? The care services for the elderly, which could be a kind of daycare for old people while you go to work, right? But it could also be care, full-time care homes where people can go and live. Care for people with disabilities, how much of the healthcare system is socialized and how much is provided for free through the public purse, and are there mechanisms for providing food, like food banks provided by municipalities, which you sort of see across Latin America, right? So those are the metrics, and then in order to pass on the Africa Care Economy Index, you have to get 18 out of 30. So how well do you think we do across the continent? Hey?
It depends on how they measure a lot of those things. So maternity, paternal leave, in the informal economy, do they include any, like how do they measure that?
The first bash at this is very simple measurable things like, is there paid maternity leave in the legislation?
The vast majority of ECDs are unregistered, so are they counted in that childcare? In South Africa, the vast majority of ECDs are unregistered. So
yeah.
They won't appear on a book, like on a report.
Right, but they
exist.
They exist, and if they come out of the public purse, there's a budget somewhere for it, right? So if it's informal and community-based, they're counting how well the states do. So they're looking at national budgets, and they're looking at national legislation, national policy. That's what they find. Looking at the statistics that are, now I mean there are a lot of issues with the quality of national statistics and so on, right? But I think it's a really interesting attempt to ground the political demand. So only 6 countries score more than 5 points. Remember, 18 is a passing grade. So we're not the most caring, wonderful people in the world, after all, perhaps, at least in terms of how we measure the states. That is because we don't make the demand on the state to do those things, right? We put care somewhere else. We've not made that as a demand of the state. Of course we are caring, and we do it using unpaid labor. We do it using poorly paid labor, and we do it in the privatized sphere rather than in the public sphere. Okay? So yes, of course, I'm not saying we're not caring. This is for argument's purposes. Where is care located? So if you think about those domains of care that I raised earlier, households, markets, states, communities, the less the state is doing like this, then the more of it is falling into that unpaid and poorly paid sector. Unregulated, without rights, without exit strategies, often for young women. Okay, so we don't actually look so good. Which then asks, well, who is doing it? If it's not provided through public resources, which are our resources, our shared resources, it's not part of our politics. We're not making political parties tell us how they're going to give us better hospitals, how they're going to give us better clinics so that our children, so that mothers are not standing for 8 hours to get the child seen to, etc., etc. Who is doing it? Who should be doing it? When we valorize family and community, then we skim over the power relations within the family. We obscure the capacity of men and older women to command women's labor. Command it. right? We don't look at the power that exists inside households and inside communities, and we leave unquestioned or poorly questioned the fact that, you know, communities may not think that everybody is worthy of care. So what did we discover in South Africa in the 80s and 90s is that actually many communities didn't think queer people who had AIDS were worthy of care, right? So queer communities had to create their own networks and systems. They didn't have the right to care because they brought it upon themselves, for example, right? So the fact that we have huge amounts of gender-based violence within families and communities where women are terribly vulnerable, that shows that you can't assume that we automatically carry Ubuntu within us, right? It's something that has to be cultivated. We have to create those habits. I don't know how many of you have read Pumla Ngola's book, Rape, a South African Nightmare, in which she shows that actually from the perspective of women, families and communities are not caring, nurturing spaces, but they can be violent and deadly for women. They can be repressive. They regulate us into being respectable in particular ways. They damp down women's demands to have careers and so on, right? Often. So it's not only this happy space. Yes and no, I want to say, from a feminist perspective, yes and no. So, we do support universal income guarantees, right? Because the hope, our hope as feminists is that this is a means through which that unpaid work would be mitigated. If not properly compensated, then at least it is mitigated, because then women will be getting some cash in hand. At some moments, even in the South African system, the expanded public works program for a time recognized care as legitimate. So you could count that as part of your public works. But remember that those are jobs that are short-term, 3 months or something, small, underpaid and so on. But okay. But it could be then that we could say, well, then you can choose to stay at home. If you had a universal income guarantee, then staying at home would mean that you had an income of some sort for the time when the child was most needy. And so that could be valuable. And it could also meet some of our demands that care is decommodified, right? And defamiliarized. Like, we could then decide, okay, there's a minimum income, I can use that for childcare, I can go to work, right? If it's not a means-tested, universal. But would it change the normative structure of patriarchy? I don't know. Even in those northern welfare states, it's still the case. With all of those policies and legislation, women do the bulk of care work, right? And it may have this perverse outcome that women, in fact, may have less leverage politically to argue for a radical redistribution of labor, because they'll be told, well, you now do have this income, but you didn't have before, so use that. So what can we do to avoid that outcome in our arguments? I think what we have to do is to link the arguments for universal income guarantees to arguments for radical redistribution of private power, and not just economic power. And we need to make that link between ideology and economy all the time in our arguments. We know that just by eliminating markets in care, for example, we're not going to automatically enhance the provision of care that we can learn from watching these experiments elsewhere. The love question, right? So I said there, unlike love, care can be both quantifiable and finite. You can't quantify love. You can't, love is not something, if you give some to Bertha, then there's nothing left for Crystal. Doesn't work like that. Okay, but care is something that I think is tied to love in various messy, fleshy ways, to use that description. Because it has these affective and intimate dimensions, right? Care, for some, in some contexts, for some of us, and sometimes we need care that involves bodily intimacy. You can't train a carer in how to do that while being dignified. You can try, but there's something else happening there. Right? There's something else happening. It's true that receiving and giving care is an expression of love, and it makes people feel happier, and we can hope for some better world when we take care of each other. But it can also be a space of harm and exploitation. And I sound like a grim feminist here. Killjoy, feminist killjoy, that's what I am. Because I want you to look at the dark side, and for us to think about how we can mitigate this dark side, right? Because it can be a source of harm and exploitation. It can be draining and depleting for the people providing the care. We talk about the virtue of being enhanced. We give care and it makes the world better and makes us all better. Yeah, but the person who's actually doing the caring is actually physically running down, emotionally running. It's hard work, right? Very often we provide the care out of a sense of duty rather than love. Let's face up to that. It's a duty. We do it because we have to. We do it because it's our responsibility to do it. And it can make us distressed and angry and frustrated and make us feel like we're losing some part of ourselves when we do it. Even where it's paid for, in a system where care is poorly paid for because it's not unionized and it's not organized and it's vulnerable people providing the care, the carers can become abusive. We have seen those stories too, where care homes, those nanny cams that show that the child is beaten or the old person is treated very roughly. We can, to some extent, we can address it through better workplace policies and through regulation. But we also, because of that many people feel they would rather be cared for by their family. Right, so I don't know what the answer to this is, by the way. I just think that if we create a politics around the provision of all of these acts of care, then we can begin to think about the trade-offs and the problems, not just talk about how aren't we wonderful in Africa because we care for our old people. They don't. We care for our children. They don't. When we do that, I feel like we skim over the real costs and who is carrying the real costs. So that's like enough of a lecture from me. And Crystal, hand it to you.